or is the dad in your song a fiction? That dad who says, look around, you're a part of this too.
I don't think so. We are extensions of history. And that part of being an American is seeking to write and address where the country has gone wrong in the past, or our previous sins or trespasses. I think there's a lot of people who view the country like that and who are interested in making it a better place. I think what we're dealing with right now, and that is unique in our history, is that an entire political party has proven itself willing to lie about that history and what's taking place for their own political gain, and has preyed on the weaknesses of a large part of our voters and our citizenry, and fears of a changing country, a changing America. And we are living in incredibly challenging times as far as technological change, social change, economic change. And people have feared their loss of status. But I think what you need at this moment is a kind of fighting optimism.
But I maybe one thing that Bruce and I share, his music, my politics, is the belief that people aren't static. I think America is proof that things are not static. So you're absolutely right that we go through moments of backlash. It's always happened. You can argue that there was a pretty strong backlash after I was elected.
I think we're still living in it.
So we've always seen those reactions, and there are going to be times because of that backlash we get a sense of despair, a sense that we're stuck, that there's no way to move forward and escape this tragic loop that we have been in. And yet, as Bruce just described, and I like that phrase, sort of a fighting optimism, there are a whole bunch of parents who are also getting up and saying, no, this is something we need to learn about. This is something that is important. It wouldn't be a controversy 20 years ago or 30 years ago because nobody would even included these stories, and nobody would have thought of including a story about slavery or Jim Crow or the Black Codes in textbooks. I know because they weren't in my textbooks and they weren't in Bruce's, I guarantee you, in Freehold. So the very fact that...
Well, this is fascinating. First of all, Bruce here needs a few more earrings. He needs a few more earrings. And I need to hear from a sophomoric artist who can sing and play guitar, by my standards, not very well. I never understood what the rave was about this guy, other than he was a cheap knockoff of Bob Dylan and without any of the talent. But that's a whole nother issue. If you like the sound of a hurdy-gurdy and carnival music, I guess Bruce Springsteen's your guy. He was never mine. I had the interesting pleasure of meeting him back in a motorcycle shop owned by Bruce's best friend's brother in Westwood, New Jersey. And he was sitting on a bike, and when I came into the shop, several of my buddies, one of which was pretty close with Bruce and Bruce's buddy, a guy named Manny, I won't tell you his last name, he ended up being his manager or producer. And my reputation even then preceded me. We're talking about like 1979 ago and 78 ago. And this little guy is sitting on a motorcycle, and I came in and everyone said hello and I said hi to them. And there was some snickering and some awkward looking grins on some of my buddies' faces. And then I realized, that's Bruce sitting on the bike, and I didn't acknowledge his highness. So I said, hey man, I'm sorry, I didn't realize who you are. How you doing? And he said, fine, with a kind of sardonic look on his face, almost in judgment. And we had a slight conversation. And a couple days before that, or even weeks, I had heard the psychobabble of a guy's wife that I knew. And she had been to one of his concerts and was rambling on to me about how philosophical he was. And, he's so deep. And, I just couldn't get over it. And I thought to myself, isn't that scary? This woman had the IQ of a dead bush. And she's laying on about this guy's philosophy, which I assure you wasn't Sophocles or Pythagoras or Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle. And it occurred to me at that moment, maybe it was an opportunity. And so I said to Mr. BS, don't you think that's rather presumptuous of you to imbue your philosophy on young skulls full of mush? Because in a sense, to me, it was bullying, using your celebrity to imbue your opinion on people, whether or not you're qualified to speak on some things isn't even the point. It's totally unfair. And I said to him, if I was 6'9", 400 pounds, and came through that door and started to lay my rap on you in an intimidating way, would that be any less bullying? And he kind of looked at me, and a few of my friends rolled their eyes, and I begged off, but I made my point, and I never forgot it. And all these years later, I guarantee you he didn't either, because he probably didn't ever have too many people speak to him that way. In any event, who are any of these people? Barack Obama never heard about slavery in America? Really? Have you never heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin? Harriet Beecher Stowe? Have you never read Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer? Have you never read a book about the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln? Have you never thought about the 375,000 Yankee boys who gave their lives to free black people from slavery? Have you never thought about that, Obama? Because if you didn't hear about that, I have to tell you, you must have ignored it with great industry. Because I started reading about the American Civil War at 6 years old, with malice toward none, with charity for all. So I've studied many different things about the Civil War, and one particular thing that I like to share with people, because I lived in Ulster and Orange County, New York. We're a very famous brigade, or regiment, the 124th New York Orange Blossoms, mustered out of Goshen and places like Newburgh and Walden, New York. And on September 6, 1862, did they leave for Virginia with 1,000 men strong. And 2.5 years later, 137 came back alive. Now you do that math. That was not atypical. It was common among Yankees from Pennsylvania, New York, Michigan, Ohio, the Iron Brigade of Wisconsin and Michigan lost 33 color bearers in 1 hour at the Battle of Gettysburg on the first day. And those were the flag bearers, not the color guard guys as well. In 1 hour. In 3 days of fighting, 50,000 casualties. And you want to tell me you don't know about the Civil War? And Mr. Springsteen, Spring Bomb, whatever your name is, do you want to really talk about sacrifice because you can strum a guitar and sing about my own town? You want to hear something funny? That song was about a company I worked for. J.P. Stevens Gulliston Carpets in Freehold, New Jersey. They had a spinning plant. And when Democrats like the Clintons came along and made sure that any company that could be outsourced to China was outsourced, companies like Gulliston shut down their spinning plants and a lot of their mills. This happened all over the South. It happened in the North. I knew about this personally. Look it up, by the way. Don't believe me. Gulliston, J.P. Stevens. J.P. Stevens was also a company in North Carolina that didn't want to unionize. And that's the story of Norma Ray, Sally Fields, when she tried to unionize the mill, because they were based in Aberdeen, North Carolina. I worked for them. And they did have a bunch of recalcitrant rednecks, but most of the people were not. They were pretty reasonable people. But the exploitation wasn't of blacks as much as it was poor people, because the textile industry never could afford a lot of pay, or a lot of you liberals wouldn't be able to afford your blue jeans and underwear, but we don't talk about that. So, I knew a lot of poor white ladies that worked at these mills. They worked their fingers to the bones in tufting houses and spinning plants. And they carded yarn. I knew a girl lost her head, literally. Her hair got caught in a cutting machine, and it pulled her in, and she was decapitated. And she was a wonderful young lady. And I will tell you this. We had a gal in the sample department named Pammy. And whatever I asked Pammy for, Pammy did. If I needed samples sent out in a quick way, she got it done. She was a wonderful gal. And sweeter than sweet. Just an absolute beautiful Southern angel. And if you've ever met a good Southern gal, they're pretty special. Young or old. And we had a vice president of sales one day not acknowledge her presence while coming into the offices that day. And I spoke to Pammy, and she told me she was unhappy that this guy, who she knew was an acquaintance and friend of mine, was very rude to her. And I made a point of calling him up and asked him what his major malfunction was. And he said, "What's the problem?" I said, "Well, this is what I heard, and I'm not going to tell you who told me, but I will tell you about this gal. She's an angel. And I would appreciate it personally if you'd go out of your way and say hello to her one day, because I let her know that you're not the son of a bitch that you came off like." And he begrudgingly acknowledged that he might have been inconsiderate, and we'll leave it at that. But the industry I was in was based in the South, and believe me when I tell you that the culture wasn't black or white as much as it was rich and poor, like it is in the North.
Stories are big.
Like it was in the North. So when you know history and you understand the dynamics of the Civil War, what motivated Abe Lincoln to hate slavery? Two things. His father, Thomas Lincoln, hated the fact that the Southern farmers that he competed against, because he lived along the border of the Mason-Dixon line, used slaves. And in states like Indiana, you couldn't. And so you were at an unfair disadvantage trying to sell your commodities against those who had the advantage of not having to pay for labor in a time when the economy was totally labor intensive. When the cotton gin came along, it drove the price of slaves from $20 to $2,000, because you could synthesize that much more cotton, which made you a lot of money, but you still had to be able to pick it, so you needed more pickers than ever. People don't know that. You know who profited most from cotton and slavery? Look it up. Fall River, Massachusetts, the greatest exporter of American cotton fabrics in the world. Places like Walden, New York, Paterson, New Jersey, New York City. Those were the real beneficiaries of slavery. Insidiously quiet. It was the northern states that made the most money because they were the basic retailers of the product. And money is always in the retail, not in the wholesale. Wholesale, they work on tiny margins. And variance is critical. So, listening to these two nitwits, Barack Insane Obama and Brucey Springbaum, Neither could fill a thimble with what they know about the Civil War, or they wouldn't have said what they said. See, their own words condemn them. Barack Obama never learned about the Civil War. He must have been living in the state of amnesia. And sophomoric little Bruce, who's a billionaire because he can wiggle his hips and play a guitar. This is what's wrong with America. $300 million football players, $10 million a year college football coaches, $300 million pitchers who can't win a big game for the Yankees. I tell you, this society is perverse, and the perverts hold the microphones, and they fill kids' heads with skulls of mush. So let me ask you, of those farming families in rural Orange County, New York, which was the breadbasket of New York City, especially for dairy products, companies like Philadelphia Cream Cheese and Velveeta from Chester and Goshen, New York. Well, these boys left their farms. Sometimes every boy in the family fought and died in the Civil War. That meant that their parents in their elderly years had no support. They had to hire people to work their fields. Do they owe a critical debt for slavery? Like in the movie Saving Private Ryan, when the famous Bixby letter is read by that general about the sacrifice upon the altar of freedom, that Mrs. Bixby laid 5 sons down upon that altar. Was Mrs. Bixby guilty of the slavery sins of America, which were created by foreigners, Dutch, Portuguese, English, French, Germans, to name a few, and the inherited legacy of that slavery business by 7 states in the South for 80 years, not 400 years. America wasn't formed as a nation until 1789. The Emancipation was signed in 1863. That's 80 years. You want to hear something ironic? Bwana Abe Lincoln freed the slaves, according to the Emancipation, in the southern states. Not in the border states, only in the southern states. He categorized them as contraband, basically property, and by doing so, confirmed the very logic of the Southerner to own a slave, because Lincoln himself declared them contraband. Now think about that. Sin begets sin. Okay? And sometimes things are not as simple as black or white. One of the wealthiest slave owners in the state of Virginia was a black man. I believe his name was Morgan. And there were ample amounts of very wealthy plantation owners in states like Mississippi that were black, and indentured servants that came here from Ireland were indentured until the 1930s. Now, that doesn't exonerate slavery. That doesn't make that, less egregious. But the fact of the matter is, it's not that simple. When you're born into a dysfunctional family, your father's a drunk, your mother's a prostitute and an abuser, are you guilty of that sin? Is the child to be punished? This is the insanity of our time. But to afflict a kid from Orange County, who may literally be a descendant of somebody like Colonel Van Horn Ellis, who died at the second day of Gettysburg, or a descendant of Oliver Cromwell, Major Cromwell of the same regiment, 124th, who died right alongside Van Horn Ellis, 1863? Excuse me. Yeah, 1863, Gettysburg, July 2nd. His mansion still stands on Angola Road in Cornwall. This man came from a lot of money. He laid his life down for his country and to free the oppressed. Is his progeny guilty of the sin of some slave owner down south, whether he be white or black? Who are the people who stopped teaching history? Republicans or Democrats? And for Mr. Springsteen here to talk about a whole party, he means the Republican Party? We're the party that doesn't want to talk about racial divisiveness? You've made an industry out of it. By the way, Abraham Lincoln was the very first Republican. The party was formed to end slavery. You glorious nitwit, Bruce Springbaum. It was the Democratic Party that controlled the Southerners. Southerners like Lyndon B. Johnson, like George Wallace, like the Clintons' friends from, that were all part of the KKK. You inglorious nitwit. You don't know enough about history to fill a thimble. But you ramble on with your stupid feelings as if you actually know something. And like this glorified interloping nerd next to you whose mother was white. And by the way, a prostitute. Obama's mother was a white prostitute. Is that Obama's fault? But we never hear anyone say that Obama's white. He's half black and half white. But we don't hear that. Why is that? Tiger Woods is half Asian and half black. But we don't hear about him being Asian. Why is that? Derek Jeter was half white and half black. But we only know that he's black. Why is that? Because the racists on the left won't allow it. The racists at ESPN in the media won't allow it. And when you hear about Colin Kaepernick, half white, half black, raised by white parents, but he was oppressed. When? Where? At the dinner table? You want to talk to a real man, a real black stud man? My favorite football player, Jim Brown, raised by white folks on Long Island. Jim Brown speaks the truth. Where there's racism, he points it out correctly. But he knows that white people or black people aren't inherently evil because of their skin color. It's as simple as there's good and bad. But to afflict young people with a sense of guilt that they owe anybody anything because of the sins of somebody else's ancestors is patently and profoundly evil and insane.